Hi, my name is April, and I'm going to be painting an orc Nob from Games Workshop. I put this boy together to carry an axe staff thing, and I used some prompts from the book right there so that I could check his points and skills. There's the screw that kind of shows you what it looked like before I put it together. I used some plastic glue to connect all of the bits, and I made sure that he had a little bad moon symbol because that's going to be the theme of this guy. So that means that he's going to be yellow and some brown with some metal and rust. So that's kind of the goal or the look that we're going for with the yellow and the metal. I decided to do pink too on that guy for some highlights, but I don't think I'm going to do it on this one. I took the time to take off any mold lines or any bits that were connected to the outside so that the paint would stick a lot better. Okay, so I have a flat brush. That's how I usually prime because it covers a lot of area and it's not a pretty brush either. So that just means I don't have to worry about messing up the bristles when I'm trying to get into nooks and crannies. I'm just using a Vallejo white base to prime just so that I can get the paint to stick to it. I'm not that worried about watering it down right now as long as I'm not clogging up any of the details. So I'm using a white undercoat because it's the best to get the yellow to show up. Yellow is normally a really translucent color, so if you were to use gray underneath of it, it'd really muddy the color, and that's not what we want. So I'm going to be building that white a lot later in the video also. I like priming with one solid color because it helps to sort of get to know where all the details are on the mini. And if you use a dry brush technique, it kind of helps to show where the light's going to hit or where the paint's going to stick to first when you start going at it with the real colors. So this base coat is pretty much just making sure that all of the colors stick properly to the plastic. Okay, so that shouldn't take that long to dry because we went on it with very thin paint. So you can see I already poured some yellow. I'm going to mix it with some brown to get a really nice sort of leather color. When I first mixed it, I didn't have a warm-based purple, so I just went in with a straight brown and then decided that it was a little too cold, so I'm going to add some red to it. If you had a darker purple or a red-based purple, that would be probably the best color to add to this. So I'm going to take a long pin brush. This is actually a watercolor brush, so it sort of really helps to hold a lot of color, which means you don't have to go back and forth to the palette. Keep in mind that the wet palette really helps to thin your paints, so don't be too worried about going back into the water pot. The first coat's going to be really thin, but we're just worried about blocking in color right now. So when you're picking colors for a little mini like this, make sure you think ahead in advance so that you know when you're looking at the entire figure, maybe where you want to put some more color. This first step's probably the most boring, but it really helps plan out how your character is going to look. A lot of the time I forget where certain patches of color are supposed to be and have to go back later to fill it in, and it just gets really annoying. So I'm trying really hard to spread out my palette to make sure that I wipe my brush before I go back to the mini, make sure that all of my brush strokes are consistent, because when you're using acrylic paint, it's a little more heavy, there's more body in it, so you want to make sure there's enough water. So one thing you have to remember when you're painting a 3D object is there's always going to be a couple extra sides to hit, so I just painted underneath of his shoulder armor, because the thickness wouldn't have shown in a 2D picture, but since it's a model, you see all sides. So you want to make sure that it makes sense where you're putting the color. So right now I'm trying to get into his chest plate. I think I picked the wrong bit for this one. I picked a really intricate like skull plate that doesn't really show because the handle of his weapon, I guess, is right in the way. So it just kind of gave me a lot more grief than the actual final project or product turned out to be. When you're painting the top, you want to make sure that you get a really solid color, so we're going to hit it with a couple of coats because that's where you're going to be putting the most light, which means you're going to have to keep covering over with more white or lighter color. And the more wet brush strokes you put on wet paint makes it very streaky and very hard to get to. So you're gonna have to be really patient with that. Alright, so after about 5 coats of brown, I think I'm ready to move on to the base coat for the orc skin. I'm using a lighter green than what's normally used because Bad Moons are normally lighter skinned orcs, and also I just think it looks way cooler. So this is a plastic paint. It's similar to acrylic, but this Citadel paint's marketed directly to paint miniatures. So I find the consistency works a little bit better than the translucent Easy Flow acrylic from Golden. I'm using a thinner brush right now because I trust this paint a lot more. I don't need to have to go back and forth or hold a lot of color because it just goes on a lot smoother than the other paint that I was using. I'm pretty confident in using a really fine tipped brush. Okay, so now I'm just gonna build up the white because like I said, we were gonna go in with some yellow later and I got a lot of that brown all over the place. So I just wanna make sure that there are no darker blotches because we're gonna go in with an undercoat later. So it'll help a lot if everything's the same color. Pretty much anything that you want to be yellow at this point, you're gonna wanna coat so that it's a bright white. Alright, so I'm done with the green, so I'm just gonna maintain my paintbrushes, make sure they're all back where I want them to be. And then we're gonna move on to some Leadbelcher. So this goes on anything that you want to be metal. It's going to really help you when it comes to highlights later too because it's metallic, which means that anywhere the light hits, it's going to reflect and tell you where to put your highlight. I'm going to leave some open spaces on this weapon so that I can put some yellow in there just to make it a little more orky and Bad Moony. Alright, so I'm just finishing up with Leadbelcher here. I pretty much covered everything that I wanted metal and left some spaces for some freehand later. I'm also going to put another coat of white on where I want to be yellow just because I was a little messy and got some other colors where they weren't supposed to be. I decided to put a little yellow spot on one of his shoulder pauldrons, so I'm putting a base coat of white there to make sure the yellow's nice and bright. I'm also doing that on the other parts of his saw. So I just made my own sort of bone color out of the brown that we used for the vest and the white that we used to prime. I'm just going to use it on the skull on his shoulder and for some of the teeth hanging from his Bad Moons sigil. Alright, so I'm going to be using some pink to undercoat the yellow. This is because yellow and pink work analogously together on the color wheel. So the undercoat of the pink will make some orange lowlights on our character. Since I'm using translucent pink paint and translucent yellow paint, they'll both have a glossy finish and they'll both be really consistent. So I'm not trying to coat the entire thing, I'm just sort of trying to glaze and make sure that some of the white shines through so that other parts of the yellow will be really bright, but then also mix with the undercoat of the pink and make it a little darker. You're going to want to focus on maybe where the shadows would be the darkest and put the most pink there and leave enough space for the white so that the yellow can shine over it. So the texture on the metal is going to be a little different because rather than a dyed cloth, it's going to be painted over something. So I'm going a little heavier on the edges to sort of show that there's some wear on it and kind of accentuate where the actual figure ends. Especially when you're going for a light color, just gotta make sure it stands from the background. Okay, so it's time to put the yellow over our undercoat of the pink there. So I'm gonna go in with another pin brush. So everywhere that you put that pink undercoat is where you're gonna wanna cover it with yellow and see how it sort of turns like this golden yellow orange color, which means our color theory worked fine. So we're done with all of the base coats, and that's how it's looking now. So now we're going to move on to the highlights. We're going to be focusing on a top-down light source, so anything that's higher on the figure is going to be lighter, highlighting everything that I painted that brown color, which means I'm going to have to mix a new color. So I'm just using some more yellow and white, and I'm going to take from the brown that we already have on the palette. I just want to make sure that it's a little bit colder than the actual base color that we have to give it some variety. So you can always use a dry brush just laying around, one of your old scrappy ones, and use it to take up extra water off of your miniature. It really helps push the color around and make sure nothing pools where it's not supposed to. So when you're blending colors, that's more what you use on a larger scale when you're trying to get from one color to another using a gradient, meaning you can't see the mixture of each color. It just kind of blends together seamlessly. But when you're glazing on a model, you're putting a watered down color over top of a solid base coat. So what we're doing is glazing on some highlights to make sure that the color shines through and melts together a little more seamlessly. So I'm working on highlighting the green now for the orc skin. The orc skin takes a little bit of color theory because you're going to want to have to think about what's underneath of it. Orcs are warm-blooded creatures, which means that the thinner parts of their skins, just like yours and mine, would be see-through or have some red blood coming out from underneath of it. So I'm trying to mix some cool colors, which is the orc flesh and that light blue, and put a little bit of warmth in it with the purple and the pink. So here I'm mixing a little bit of purple into yellow because they're opposite colors. It should make a warm brown color. If you're gonna mix like a flesh tone, this is what you would want to do and add some white to it. So I'm adding pink to the purple and yellow because it wasn't quite warm enough, and I'm trying to go for a cartoon look when it comes to this character. So I'm taking some of the base coat and adding the blue into it and some more white. When you're highlighting the arm or the flesh in particular, it can be the most fun part, but it's a lot of work. You're gonna wanna make sure that you focus on each section of the arm and make sure that you highlight every individual bump. Make sure to give those elbows a little bit of love too, because that's where we're gonna be putting the warm highlight later. So same with the knuckles, you're going to want to put a lot of color down on those because that's where the warm is going to show through later. So if you build up the lighter color, it's going to create an easier base to put the warm highlight on over top. Okay, so I'm just finishing up the cold highlights now on top of the ears. So that is the blocking for everywhere that we're going to put some warm over it too. So everywhere that you want to keep cold and light is going to be the top of the head, the top of the shoulders, or maybe where the muscles stick out a little bit more. And we're going to go in with a warm highlight on all of the thinner skin. Make sure you spend a lot of time focusing on the face because that's going to be where people look first. All right, and all done with the warm tones. So when it comes to the saw, you can just kind of wing it. Anything that looks to be a little bit lifted, you can kind of just rub the white over top of it. Don't worry too much, because the brush is going to pick up on the highest point anyway, so just be really gentle and try and run your brush over the edges. So I'm using the same dark brown to do the lowlights on my orc. When you mix a color, it makes it really easy to add some lighter portions or some darker portions, because when you mix two colors together, there's always one that's going to be lighter and darker, which means that you have your derivative to shade. Makes it a lot easier and it makes it look like it's sort of the same material. So when you're shading, you want to make sure that your paints are a little more watered down, because the way that the model works is there are more recesses that the paint can be trapped in, so then you don't have to really worry about going in and painstakingly staring at it for too long and blending it. If you can just wash over it and kind of blend all the colors together but have the deeper parts darker, because that's where the paint will collect. So I'm using a very thin watercolor brush so that I can hold more water when I'm painting. And I'm just hitting everywhere that the light would be stopped. So anything that's in your way and would be casting a shadow, make sure that you hit that with a darker color. So I actually happen to have an orc contrast for flesh. It looks pretty good with that green that I used, so I'm just going to use that. The contrast paints are a lot more watery than your bases, which makes it really awesome for blending. So I'm using the same watercolor brush for this because I don't want too much color to clog up all of that highlight work that we just did. So I'm really just gently pushing it into the deeper parts of the model. And I'm sort of using extra water to kind of blend it so that the orc flesh without the highlight still shines through, but then we also get those two tones of the base and the highlight plus the dark underneath. So you're going to want to put that in all of the recesses, maybe the parts that are hidden from the light, and all of the parts on the arm that would cast a shadow. So now I'm just going to touch up and put some details on this guy. This is my favorite part. It always makes the model look a little more characterized. So my plan here is to put some black in the Bad Moon's sigil and also some red in the eyes. I'm also going to touch up the teeth underneath of his sigil, make sure that they look really cool because he is a Bad Moon's orc, which means that he's super rich, and everybody knows that the currency for orcs are orc teeth. Really just try and hold your hand steady and take a deep breath and hope everything goes okay. Okay, so that is my finished Bad Moon orc next to my old guy who I used for inspiration, my little storm boy. I decided to put him on his toxic waste base with a little knife sticking out there. He's kind of stranded in a lake of toxic waste. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me, and thanks for watching.